Hello history buffs and welcome back to the channel. We have finally made it. We are about to start our exploration into King Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. Catherine was born in around 1512 to parents Sir Thomas Parr, a descendant of King Edward III, and Maud Green. Alison Weir thinks that Catherine was born either at her father's castle at Kendal or in his London house at Blackfriars. Catherine's mother Maud was only 17 when Catherine was born, and she was shortly followed by a brother, William, and a younger sister, Anne. The Parrs weren't a well-off family, but they were a well-connected one and well-respected, as they had ties to noble northern families such as the Throckmortons and the Nevilles. Catherine received an education that would prepare her for a life as a wife and a mistress of a household. It is also thought that she had some sort of humanist teaching as well, as this was becoming very popular for the daughters of the courtiers of King Henry VIII. Dominic Sandbrock stated in his article for the Daily Mail, quote, "She could read Latin, spoke excellent French, and was fascinated by new ideas. She was also kind-hearted and fun, and everybody liked her."
Alrighty then.
Catherine's father died on the 11th of November 1517, when she was about 5, leaving his wife Maud to raise 3 children. Catherine's mother became a pivotal figure in her life, and Maud was a very religious woman, and taught her children to love God. Maud also took her children's education very seriously, which is why out of all of Henry's wives, Catherine was the most knowledgeable and intellectual of them all, which is saying something, as Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn both had very, very good educations. It is said that Catherine Parr didn't enjoy the hours of schooling that her mother put her through, and claimed that her hands were destined to touch crowns and sceptres, not needles and spindles. Although Alison Weir speculates that this is just a tale, and I'm inclined to agree with her. After the death of her father, her uncle Sir William Parr of Horton and a cousin, Cuthbert Tunstall, the Bishop of Durham, took an interest in Catherine and her siblings. In 1524, when Catherine was only 12, Maud entered marriage negotiations with Lord Dacre for his grandson, Henry Scrope, to wed Catherine. Lord Dacre had proposed the match as he felt that Catherine would be a good match for his grandson. Maud agreed to the proposal, but ran into some disagreements when it came to settling the dowry and jointure. A series of letters survives, revealing that Lord Scrope, Dacre's son-in-law, and Henry's father not only offered a meagre sum, but was also unwilling to return Catherine's dowry if she died before the marriage could be consummated, or if it remained unconsummated for any reason.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
Unsurprisingly, the match fell through. Lord Dacre tried to save the match and persuaded Lord Scrope to change his mind, reminding his son-in-law that Lady Parr was of the good wise stock of the Greens, and warned him that his demands were so far asunder that it is impossible ye can ever agree. But Lord Scrope would not budge, and in early 1525, Lady Parr told Lord Dacre, "Thanks, but no thanks," and looked elsewhere for her daughter. Just as well, really, as the potential groom died on the 25th of March that year.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
In 1529, at the age of 16 or 17, Catherine married Edward Lord Burr, although I have also seen that Catherine was placed at 14 at the time of her marriage, but the majority of sources say 16/17, so let's go with that. Historians debate which Edward de Burr Catherine did marry, as some believe it was Sir Edward de Burr, who died in April 1533, which I believe is the more accepted theory, while other sources, mainly older biographies like the one written by my bae Alison Weir, have stated that it was Sir Edward's grandfather, Edward de Burr, 2nd Baron Borough of Gainsborough. I'm personally torn, as I can see arguments for both, But for now, let's just say it was the Edward that died in April 1533, as that's what's most commonly accepted now. Catherine lived in the house of her parents-in-law until her and her new husband were given a home of their own at Curton in Lindsey. Not much is known about Catherine and Edward's relationship, other than Edward was a few years older, and that the marriage did not produce any children by the time Edward died in April 1533. Catherine was a widow at the age of 21, though she would not be a widow for long. Her mother Maud had died a few years prior, so it is thought that Catherine spent her gap year, if you like, with some family at Caesar Castle in Westmoreland before remarrying in the summer of 1534.
That was fast.
John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, was about 40 with 2 children. Although we don't know much about Catherine and John's relationship, what we do know is that the couple seemed quite happy together. Lord Latimer was kind to Catherine, and when he died in 1543, he left her 2 manors and a lot of money. John Neville, Lord Latimer, was a member of the great medieval house of Neville that had been so prominent during the reign of the late Plantagenets. Like with Catherine's first husband, Lord Burr, this wasn't Lord Latimer's first marriage. In fact, he had been married twice before. Firstly, to Dorothy de Vere, the daughter of the Earl of Oxford, and together they had 2 children, a daughter, and Lord Latimer's heir, John. Lady Dorothy died on the 7th of February 1527. After the death of Dorothy, John was looking for a new wife, and a year later, on the 20th of July 1528, he wed for a second time to Elizabeth Musgrave. The marriage was short and childless, as Elizabeth died soon after. Catherine was Lord Latimer's 3rd wife when they wed in 1533. Unfortunately, no date was recorded for the wedding. Being a lord with land primarily in the north and coming from a Catholic family, Lord Latimer was one of the nobles who sided with the rebels during the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. It has been said that Lord Latimer was not favoured by King Henry VIII or Cromwell, and seemed likely to be punished for his role in the revolt. However, the Duke of Norfolk spoke on his behalf, and he was pardoned. Although Alison Weir states in her book The 6 Wives of King Henry VIII, quote, Lord and Lady Latimer were often at court. They were on good terms with Henry VIII, who had fortunately decided to overlook Latimer's part in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Weir also states that she believes that it might have been around this time that Catherine became interested in Protestantism. Afterwards, he and Catherine moved to the south of England. Catherine interceded with the king in 1540 for the release of her cousin Sir George Throckmorton, who had been imprisoned in the Tower by Cromwell for his open criticism of the royal supremacy. Motivated by the pleas of Throckmorton's distressed wife, Catherine Vaux, another cousin, Catherine Parr approached the king when he was in a good mood and humbly requested Sir George's release. It was a favourable moment to appeal to Henry, as he was plotting Cromwell's downfall and planning his wedding to Catherine Howard, and he happily agreed to Lady Latimer's request. While at court, Catherine would have witnessed the rise and fall of 2 of her predecessors, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard. Lord Latimer fell ill in 1542, and on the 12th of September 1542 he makes his will. Lord Latimer died in early 1543, making Catherine a widow again at 30 years old, give or take. It's not clear whether Catherine nursed Lord Latimer through his illness or whether she began to spend time at court with the king's eldest daughter, Lady Mary. Either way, while at court, the now widowed Catherine had caught the eye of the king, who before long had begun sending her gifts and visiting her daily, which is quite sad really, as Catherine had her eye set on another man, Thomas Seymour. On the 16th of February 1543, just days after the execution of Catherine Howard, King Henry VIII gave Catherine Parr a gift of pleats and sleeves. Lord Latimer was not dead yet, but it was known that he didn't have long. The Exchequer accounts also record that Henry ordered gowns in the Italian style for Catherine. It was highly unusual for the king to give rich gifts to a married woman, and Catherine, undoubtedly worried about her husband's health, was unsettled by receiving them. However, she didn't dare return them. Lord Latimer finally died on the 3rd of March 1543. I mean, come on guys, he had been ill for ages. Catherine remained at court after her husband's death, not due to the king's interest, but because of the evident admiration for a Sir Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane.
Wait a tick. That means I'm single again. Oh, behave! Yeah!
Sir Thomas, about 6 years older than Catherine Parr, was very handsome, impetuous, and extremely ambitious. He saw the rich and attractive widow as a means to increase his fortune. Since January, upon his return to court from a diplomatic mission to Nuremberg, Thomas Seymour had been working on Catherine's emotional susceptibilities. After Lord Latimer's death, Catherine began to encourage this dashing and unscrupulous adventurer as a suitor. She was both physically and emotionally attracted to him, and it wasn't long before they were discussing marriage. At the same time, a scandal erupted in the Parr family. As the king began to nurture an amorous interest in the widowed Lady Latimer, her brother William, Lord Parr, applied to Parliament for a divorce from his wife on the grounds of her adultery with an unidentified lover, with whom she had eloped in 1542. His wife, Anne Bourchier, daughter and heiress of the last Earl of Essex of the Bourchier line, had married Lord Parr in February 1526. Furthermore, Lord Parr was so incensed at his wife's infidelity that he was pressing the king to authorise the highest penalty for her offence, which at the time was death. Her brother's actions shocked Catherine Parr, who refused to let her sister-in-law face execution. According to the chronicler Hall, she went directly to the king, threw herself at his feet, and refused to rise until he promised to spare Lady Parr from the headsman's axe. At first, Henry protested, saying, "Madam, you know that the law enacts that a woman of rank who so forgets herself shall die, unless her husband pardon her." Catherine replied, "Your Majesty is above the law, and I will try to get my brother to pardon her." Eventually, Henry agreed, saying, "If your brother can be content, I will pardon her." Catherine then spoke to her brother, who, aware of the king's interest in his sister, knew he was defeated. He forgave his wife and was rewarded for his clemency. On the 17th of April 1543, Parliament granted William Parr a divorce and passed an act declaring her children bastards, unfit to inherit. Her Essex estates were then entailed to her husband, who was created Earl of Essex that December. In her book, The Six Wives of King Henry VIII, Alison Weir claims that in the spring of 1543 that, up until now, Catherine had been unaware of the king's feelings, as she had been too focused on Thomas Seymour. It now dawned on her that he too was a suitor. But I would argue that Catherine couldn't have been so naive, especially seeing as the king had been sending her luxurious gifts since February, something that was unusual for a married woman to receive. She goes on to say, he was lonely and feeling sorry for himself, and only Lady Latimer's presence could ease him. But Catherine, as already mentioned, had no interest in the king. She wanted Thomas. Henry had thought that this might have been the case, so he came up with a plan to get rid of Thomas.
Don't worry, Mr. B. I have a cunning plan to solve the problem.
In May 1543, Henry sent Thomas Seymour on a permanent embassy to the court of the region of the Netherlands in Brussels, effectively removing him from the scene.
Coincidence? I think not!
This must have been a blow for both Catherine and Sir Thomas, for different reasons. Catherine was obliged to conceal her true feelings, and as the king began to pursue her earnestly, leaving her no choice but to pretend his advances were welcomed. It was in the early summer of 1543 that Henry proposed to Catherine Parr. She wasn't initially keen. After all, who could blame her? The king wasn't exactly offering much. Well, apart from a kingdom and wealth, although she didn't need the wealth. But she did have a sexier man abroad who equally and arguably loved her. Catherine later wrote to Seymour to tell him that as soon as her husband, Lord Latimer, had died in 1543, as truly as God is God, my mind was fully bent to marry you before any man I knew. Howbeit, God withstood my will therein most vehemently for a time, and through his grace and goodness made that possible which seemeth to me most unpossible, to renounce utterly mine own will and to follow his most willingly. Catherine asked the king for time to consider his proposal, and she turned to her faith to guide her. In her spiritual autobiography, Lamentations of a Sinner, which Catherine published in November 1547 after the king's death, she declared, "Neither life, honour, riches, neither whatsoever I possess here, be it never so dearly beloved of me, but most willingly and gladly I would leave it to win any man to Christ, of what degree or sort soever he were." Did this final clause imply that she hoped to sway the king to her way of thinking? While we cannot entirely avoid speculation regarding Catherine's soul-searching in the summer of 1543, the country's extremely tense religious situation must have certainly influenced her thoughts. Ultimately, Catherine accepted the king's proposal, as he became more and more insistent. Having been married twice now, become a stepmother, and nursed her last husband through illness, no wife of Henry's had been this prepared and well suited to the task of being his queen since Catherine of Aragon. Catherine's appearance, however, was not her main attraction. People were drawn to her warm and friendly personality and her intellectual qualities. She was an excellent conversationalist who enjoyed friendly debates, particularly on religious doctrine, and she found favour with Cranmer and his reformist party. John Fox also remarked of Catherine that she was but a woman accompanied with all the imperfections natural to the weakness of her sex. Despite this biased masculine view, typical of that period, reformers saw Catherine as the perfect instrument to influence the king. Catherine's primary interest lay in theology. She was deeply fascinated by godly matters. As a devoted subject of King Henry VIII, she held a strong disdain for the Pope, even comparing him to the Pharaoh by stating, "He hath been and is the greater persecutor of all true Christians than ever was Pharaoh of the children of Israel." Eager to advance her religious views, she wrote and published 2 books, demonstrating her intellectual prowess. This marks the first time an English queen had openly shared her personal views with her subjects, and we are fortunate to have these works as a testament to the thoughts of this remarkable queen. Naturally, much of her writing mirrored the political ideology of the time, and Catherine was lavish in her praise of King Henry VIII. "Thanks be to the Lord that he hath sent us such a godly and learned king in these latter days to reign over us. King Henry VIII, my most sovereign, favourable lord and husband. One, if Moses had figured any more than Christ, through the excellent grace of God, meet to be another express verity of Moses, conquest over Pharaoh." On the 10th of July 1543, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer issued a special licence for the marriage of Henry VIII and Lady Catherine Latimer. 2 days later, the pair were wed at Hampton Court Palace. The wedding of Catherine Parr and Henry VIII must have been a small, intimate affair, as the Queen's privy closet, or Lady Chapel, a room I have been in several times, is quite literally a closet. It's about 10 by 14 metres. If you go to Hampton Court, the Queen's closet is the small room with the 2 pews and cushions. The ceremony was presided over by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Unfortunately, there is no record what time the ceremony took place or what Catherine was even wearing, unlike some of his previous marriages. But Richard Watkins, the king's prothonotary, principal clerk of a court, did make an official record of the marriage and included the names of those present, which included the king's daughters and his niece Margaret Douglas. The king and Lady Catherine Latimer, alias Parr, being met there for the purpose of solemnising matrimony between them. Stephen, Bishop of Winchester, proclaimed in English that they were met to join in marriage, the said king and Lady Catherine, and if anyone knew any impediment thereto, he should declare it. According to Catherine Parr's biographer, Linda Porter, the vows for Henry and Catherine's wedding were identical to those taken at all of Henry's weddings, and virtually unchanged by the Reformation or centuries. They are the words still spoken at Anglican weddings. Which is true. They are similar to the vows spoken at modern weddings. According to Watkins, the following people were present at the wedding: John, Lord Russell, Keeper of the Privy Seal; Sir Anthony Browne, Captain of the King's Pensioners; Thomas Heanage; Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford; Henry Knivet; Richard Long; Thomas Darcy; Edward Bainton; Thomas Speke; Anthony Denny; William Herbert, that's Catherine's brother-in-law, who had married her sister Anne Parr; the Lady Mary, the king's daughter; the Lady Elizabeth, the king's daughter; Margaret Douglas, the king's niece; Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, who was Catherine's friend and wife of Henry's bestie, Sir Charles Brandon; Anne Stanhope, Countess of Hertford, the wife of Edward Seymour and Catherine's future sister-in-law; Jane Dudley, Viscountess Lisle; and Catherine's sister, Anne Herbert. We don't know if any celebrations took place after the wedding, as there are no surviving records, but it could also be down to the fact that it was a discreet, intimate affair, a far contrast to some of the grand weddings of Henry's past. Catherine was proclaimed Queen of England the same day as the wedding, but again, fitting with the low-key theme, there was no talk of a coronation, and no great state entry into London. Her relationship with the king, Catherine was youthful enough to captivate him sexually, but being mature enough to understand and attend to his other needs. Caring for his festering sores was undoubtedly unpleasant, and engaging him in stimulating conversation to distract him from his pain must have been mentally exhausting. But Catherine took her vows seriously, taking milk baths to keep her skin soft, and the day after her wedding, she ordered fine perfumes for her chamber at Hampton Court, all in an attempt to make her and her bedchamber as enticing for the king as possible. A few days after their wedding, the king and his new queen went on a summer progress, their first stop being Oatlands Palace in Surrey. Go check out my video if you want to learn more, as I actually went to the last remaining wall of that palace. It would be here at Oatlands that Catherine wrote to her brother William, "It having pleased God to incline the king to take her as his wife, which is the greatest joy and comfort that could happen to her, she informs her brother of it, as the person who has most cause to rejoice thereat, and requires him to let her sometimes hear of his health, as friendly as if she had not been called to this honour. Given at my Lord's Manor of Oatlands, 20th of July. Catherine, who was already a stepmother from a previous marriage, was concerned to learn that her new stepchildren, the Prince Edward and the Ladies Mary and Elizabeth, rarely saw their father, and lived so far away from court. So, with the king's permission, of course, she wrote to all three of her new stepchildren and invited them to come visit at court. Catherine recognised that they were lacking a warm maternal figure in their lives, which arguably had been provided to the younger children by their eldest sibling, Mary herself, who was now approaching 30. But nonetheless, she took an interest in their well-being, and for Edward and Elizabeth, their education, by essentially marking their homework, or in Mary's case, sending a court musician to perform for her. Mary enjoyed being back at court, and due to her and Catherine being of a similar age, became great friends. Catherine gave Mary all the respect of a princess, and they became quite close, sharing similar interests. Except religion.
True.
Elizabeth, who was yet to experience a stable mother figure, practically jumped at the chance when Catherine reached out. She thanked Catherine for her kindness, for which she felt she did not deserve. Eager to please, Elizabeth promised Catherine that she would be obedient and respectful to her new mother. I await with much impatience the orders of the king my father, for the accomplishment of the happiness for which I sigh, and I remain with much submission, Your Majesty's very dear Elizabeth. It wasn't long till Elizabeth joined her sister Mary at court. Catherine's influence also helped ease the tensions between the king and his youngest daughter, who had never felt comfortable in her presence, probably because she had inherited much of her mother's personality and charm, a woman that he wanted to forget. But thanks to Catherine, Henry's opinion towards Elizabeth softened. Edward, on the other hand, well, he wasn't at court as often as his sisters, mainly because Henry was petrified that his only male heir might catch a disease. Edward still felt Catherine's presence, even if it was from far away. She still oversaw his education and progress, and even the callous young prince would come to love his stepmother. Building a good relationship with all three royal children was undoubtedly important. But Catherine's main focus was on the king himself. Henry was not just an overweight tyrant. He was a lonely and unhappy man, following the disastrous marriage to the naive Catherine Howard. Catherine Parr recognised his need for love and attention. The circumstances allowed her to quickly establish herself as a significant influence in his life, as the plague kept them outside the capital and in each other's company for 6 months. This created an ideal foundation for their relationship. As a result, the king lavished her with jewels and fine clothing, and entrusted her with the Regency while he fought the French in 1544, and he hoped to have children with her. Thanks to Catherine's intervention and her ability to repair and rebuild the relationship between her husband and her stepchildren, a few months later, on the 7th of February 1544, a new Act of Succession was passed. This Act of Succession brought Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession behind their brother Edward, and any issue that Catherine and Henry would produce. Good luck with that. It also stated, which, if I was Catherine, would sound a few alarm bells, the children the king might have by other queens. Other queens? I'd be like, sorry, where do you think I'm going? That summer, Henry went on campaign in France, and on the 7th of July, he announced that his beloved wife would be regent in his absence, an honour that only one of his other wives held, Catherine of Aragon. With the king gone, Catherine took the opportunity to provide a stable family unit for her children and called them to Hampton Court Palace. As regent, her duties meant that she met daily with her advisors, acted politically, signed documents, and gave orders on behalf of her husband, the king. And Catherine proved, even if only for a short spell, that a woman could rule effectively. She was also, probably, using this time to effectively lay the groundwork for her being on her stepson's Regency Council when the time came. Catherine would have known the state of Henry's health from her time nursing him, and she would have known that his time was limited. And if Edward has had a say, she may have been on the council, as he did see her as his mother. As tragically, Jane wasn't around long enough for Edward to really remember her, and his longest stepmother prior to Catherine Parr lasted for less than 2 years. Catherine accompanied Henry to the port as he embarked on his French campaign, kissed him farewell, and then she led the country in prayer for his success and safe return. This prayer was written by Catherine herself and was to be read in churches up and down the country. Once he had departed, Catherine returned to Greenwich to continue with her duties as regent, and she wrote to Henry regularly while he was away, and in general the letters between them were quite affectionate, although none of them had quite the same zest as the exchanges between Henry and Anne Boleyn.
Oh my!
That September, Boulogne fell to the English. The Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis noted, "I never in my life saw the king so joyful and in such good spirits and so elated." Clearly, the campaign had bolstered Henry's mood. Nothing like a bit of war to cheer you up, eh? Back at home, there had been another outbreak of plague, so Catherine and her Tudor children had been staying with the Countess of Rutland at Oakham. On the 19th of September, days after Henry's victory in France, Catherine ordered a general thanksgiving to take place up and down the country in gratitude for the king's successes. She then wrote to her husband, "I thank God for a prosperous beginning of your affairs, and I rejoice at the joyful news of your good health." Henry arrived at Dover on the 30th, and the king and queen were finally reunited after months apart, and they openly displayed their affection for each other that had been so prevalent in their letter exchanges. However, that October saw the return of Sir Thomas Seymour from the Low Countries. You know, the man that Catherine originally wanted to marry and was, probably still is, in love with.
This is awkward.
Understandably, Henry was a bit concerned with regards to Seymour's intentions with his wife, the Queen. But as far as we know, there was not even as much as a murmur of a scandal. So whatever the pair really felt was hidden well. And it seems that Catherine treated Thomas no differently to anyone else, and Thomas seemed to follow her lead. Either way, just as a precaution, Henry appointed Thomas as Lord High Admiral of England, which meant that Thomas would be spending long periods of time away from court. Again.
Coincidence? I think not!
In March 1545, the king's health declined due to a severe fever, worsening his already volatile temper. Reports of spreading Protestant heresies further aggravated him, leading to a crackdown on dissent. As part of his inquiries, 23 individuals were arrested, including a 23-year-old woman named Anne Askew. She had previously sought a legal separation from her husband, Thomas Kyme, who had expelled her from their home and denied her access to their children. While it is speculated that Anne knew Queen Catherine Parr, there is no evidence to confirm this, although Catherine was secretly sympathetic to Anne's Protestant beliefs. After admitting to being a Protestant under questioning, Anne was imprisoned for several months, and her connection to Catherine would later bring the Queen trouble, although there wasn't really a connection between them. 1545 saw the release of Catherine's first book. Catherine was the first Queen of England and first English woman to publish under her own name. This book was the short title of Prayer and Mediations, wherein the mind is stirred patiently to suffer all afflictions her, to set at naught the vain prosperity of this world, and always to long for the everlasting felicity, collected out of holy works by the most virtuous and gracious Princess Catherine, Queen of England, was a success, with both the universities of Oxford and Cambridge begging her to come be their patron, an honour that she accepted. Catherine's court was a hub of education, and she cultivated a space for high standard of female education, to the point that even male scholars wanted her patronage. Catherine even funded scholars and educational projects solely from her own pockets, when the privy purse would not. She did not believe in turning away those who sought education just because they couldn't afford it. In late autumn of 1545, while at Windsor, King Henry VIII suffered a serious attack, leaving him in severe pain. likely due to venous thrombosis in his leg. On Christmas Eve, the new Spanish ambassador, Francois van der Delft, as Chapuis had retired and returned home, reported that Henry was so unwell that, given his age and corpulence, fears are entertained for his survival. Queen Catherine would sit by her husband's bedside, and despite her efforts to try and comfort him by engaging in lively theological debates, conservative factions at court grew suspicious. They believed Catherine, influenced by Protestant sympathisers, namely the Seymour brothers, which of course includes Thomas, who we have spoken about in length, and the Duchess of Suffolk, Lady Hertford and Lady Dudley, who were in her household, and that they, through the Queen, might be trying to convert the King. Bishop Gardiner and Wriothesley saw this as an opportunity to undermine the Queen, hoping to expose her alleged Protestant learnings and thereby remove her influence over Henry. Catherine, aware of the danger, remained undeterred, knowing that the King's favour could quickly turn to hatred if he learned she secretly harboured Protestant beliefs. In June 1546, the King granted permission for Anne Askew to be re-examined for heresy in the Tower of London. The interrogation was led by Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, who viewed this as another opportunity to implicate the Queen. When Anne remained steadfast, he ordered her to be placed on the rack and, along with Sir Richard Rich, personally conducted the examination. Anne later dictated an account of the events in which she recounted being questioned about her knowledge of the beliefs held by the ladies of the Queen's household. She responded that she knew nothing. It was suggested that she had received gifts from these ladies, but she denied this. For her defiance, she was subjected to prolonged torture on the rack, but bravely refused to cry out. When she fainted from the pain, the Lord Chancellor himself revived her and, with Rich's assistance, turned the wheels of the rack. Afterwards, Anne's shattered body was left on the cold floor as Wriothesley continued to question her for another 2 hours about her heresy and any potential involvement with the royal household. His efforts were futile. Anne steadfastly refused to renounce her Protestant faith and could not or would not implicate anyone close to the Queen. There is no contemporary evidence to suggest that the Queen had any connection with Anne Askew. The only sources for this claim date from the Elizabethan era, but the incident was enough to alert Catherine to the fact that her enemies were ready to strike. Anne was sentenced to death and was burnt at the stake on the 16th of July, 1546.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
If Catherine Parr was distressed by Anne Askew's death, she dared not reveal it. Like others, she was horrified to learn that Anne had to be carried to her execution, as her legs were rendered useless from the torture. However, Catherine kept her feelings hidden, aware that if her enemies discovered she shared Anne's beliefs, she might also face execution. John Fox claimed that Henry VIII's affection for Catherine had cooled at this time, although this is not supported by contemporary evidence. Catherine had not conceived in 3 years, and Henry was becoming jealous of the praise she received for her intellect. The Catholic faction, fearing the rise of Protestant influence, saw an opportunity to undermine her, as they believed Henry's love and esteem for her were waning. Bishop Gardiner, aware of Henry's dislike for being contradicted, noticed that the king was becoming increasingly irritated by Catherine's arguments. As Henry's health declined, he became more irritable and impatient, ceasing his daily visits to her chambers. Catherine was left to decide whether or not to risk his foul moods by visiting him after dinner or supper. One day, Henry had had enough with Catherine's conversation, and he cut her short and changed the subject, which for her seemed very out of character. Once the subject matter had become less contentious, Henry seemed all right again. When he left, he said, "Farewell, sweetheart." However, Gardiner had overheard the conversation, and when Henry complained about his wife's behaviour, "A good hearing it is when women become such clerks, and much to my comfort to come in mine old age, to be taught by my wife." Gardiner took advantage of the conversation, saying, it was unseemly for any of his subjects to argue with him so malapertly as the Queen had just done, and it was grievous for any of his counsellors to hear it done, since those who are so bold in words would not scruple to proceed to acts of disobedience. He added significantly that he could make great discoveries if he were not deterred by the Queen's powerful faction. Besides this, the religion by the Queen maintained did not only dissolve the politic government of princes, but also taught the people that all things ought to be in common. Gardiner had somehow convinced Henry that his wife was leading a heretical conspiracy, but Henry wanted proof to support these accusations. Catherine's sister, Anne, Lady Herbert, was arrested along with two of her other favourite ladies-in-waiting. The women were interrogated about the books they kept, and their coffers were searched to try and find evidence against the Queen. The women were then released. While at Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII indicated that he was open to having a warrant drawn up for Queen Catherine's arrest if there were suspicions of heresy. Unaware of this, Catherine continued to engage the king in religious debates, not realising that he was now scrutinising her words for any sign of heresy. It seems he was not yet fully convinced of her guilt. When the warrant for Catherine's arrest was prepared, the king signed it, and it was entrusted to a member of the Privy Council. However, this person accidentally dropped the warrant, and a servant loyal to the Queen found it and delivered it to her. Realising her impending doom, Catherine was overcome with fear, recalling the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Her distress was so intense that she took to her bed, wailing and crying, her anguish heard throughout the palace. Hearing her cries, Henry, unaware of the reason for her distress, sent his physician, Dr. Wendy, to calm her. Wendy suspected she had discovered the plot against her, advised Catherine to align herself with the king's views to regain his favour. Though his advice offered little comfort, it eventually led Catherine to resolve to avoid religious debates and instructed her ladies to rid themselves of any forbidden books. Her main priority became conforming to her husband's wishes to ensure her safety. That night, with her sister, Lady Herbert, and Lady Lane, Catherine made her way to see her husband, the king. He welcomed her courteously, and then, after a while, brought up the topic of religion. But Catherine wasn't going to fall for this, so she gave dutiful answers, saying, "So God hath appointed you a supreme head of us all, and of you next unto God will I ever learn," protesting that her meaning had been mistaken, for I have always held it preposterous for a woman to instruct her lord. She then clarified that if they had ever differed on opinion in religion, that she was only trying to pass away the pain and weariness of your present infirmity, which encouraged me in this boldness, in the hope of profiting withal by your Majesty's learned discourse. I am but a woman, with all the imperfection natural to the weakness of my sex. Therefore, in all matters of doubt and difficulty, I must refer myself to your Majesty's better judgment, as to my lord and head. Shockingly, stroking the king's ego worked. Is it so, sweetheart? Then we are perfect friends, as ever at any time heretofore. He vowed never to doubt her again. It was late at night when he finally allowed her to leave, and after she had gone, he spoke highly of her to his gentleman. Henry was astute enough to understand why Gardiner and his faction wanted the Queen removed, and had long been aware of the bishop's schemes. Now, with clear evidence of the Queen's loyalty, he was eager to thwart their plans. Catherine's servant had carefully returned the arrest warrant to its original place, where it was soon retrieved by the councillor. The day after the King and Queen's reconciliation, Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, unaware of the previous night's events, prepared to act on the warrant. That afternoon, the King ensured that the Queen joined him for a walk in the palace gardens, where he was as pleasant as ever. Suddenly, in the midst of their laughter, the Lord Chancellor arrived with 40 of the King's guards, intending to arrest the Queen and her 3 ladies who were also present. Wriothesley was taken aback to find the royal couple so happily engaged. The King, now looking very stern, walked a short distance, calling his Chancellor after him. Wriothesley fell to his knees, trying to explain his presence, but Henry abruptly cut him off, shouting, "Knave! Arrant knave! Beast! Fool!" and ordered him out of his sight. The Chancellor and his men quickly retreated, leaving Henry furious. Catherine, feigning innocence, asked what was wrong, and charitably offered to intercede for the Lord Chancellor, believing his actions to be a mistake. The King replied, "Ah, poor soul, thou little knowest, Kate, how little he deserveth this grace at thy hands. On my word, sweetheart, he hath been to thee a very knave, so let him go." Catherine wisely remained silent, fully aware of Wriothesley's true intentions, and recognising her narrow escape. She had learned her lesson and resolved to be the meek and dutiful wife, ensuring that no hint of heresy would arise in her household, and that she would conduct herself with even greater caution, giving her enemies no further cause for criticism. Catherine would face another plot to replace her in December 1546, this time with the King's daughter-in-law, Mary Howard, Duchess of Richmond, who had been married to Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. The plot seems to have been orchestrated by Mary's brother, the Earl of Surrey. When Mary was questioned about the plot, she obviously incriminated her brother, but also her father, the Duke of Norfolk, which, considering his track record, I wouldn't be surprised if he did have something to do with it. He obviously ran out of nieces to exploit.
Not a great plan.
The Earl of Surrey and the Duke of Norfolk were arrested on a charge of high treason on the 12th of December and taken to the Tower. Norfolk pleaded for his life, but Henry, whose health was ailing at this point, still hadn't forgiven him for what had happened with Norfolk's niece and Henry's previous wife, Catherine Howard. You could also just throw some bitterness about Anne Boleyn on top of that if you wanted to. Either way, this was Henry's chance to get revenge against a man he hadn't trusted since the fall of Catherine Howard. On the 30th of December 1546, King Henry VIII dictated his will, naming Prince Edward as his heir, and the crown to pass to any future children that his entirely beloved wife, Queen Catherine, might bear, if there were no such heirs. The succession would go to Lady Mary and her descendants, followed by Lady Elizabeth and hers, and then to the heirs of his late sister, Mary Duchess of Suffolk. Henry's animosity towards Scotland led him to exclude the descendants of his elder sister, Margaret Tudor, ensuring that Mary, Queen of Scots, would only rule England if she married Edward. And I just want to clarify here, because I'm not 100% sure if the script is like that clear. So it says that basically it goes to Edward. If Edward doesn't have any children or any heirs, then it goes to any children he had with Queen Catherine. If she hasn't got any children, then it goes to Lady Mary and her heirs. If not, then it goes to Elizabeth and her heirs. If not, then we go to Henry's sister Mary and her heirs, which is obviously how Lady Jane Grey gets her claim later on. Okay, just making sure we're on the same page. As a token of his appreciation for Queen Catherine's great love, obedience, chastity of life and wisdom, Henry bequeathed her £3,000 in plate, jewels, and household goods, along with the freedom to take as many of her clothes as she wished, which were a significant value. Additionally, she would receive £1,000 in cash along with her dower and jointure as determined by Parliament, making her a very wealthy widow. Henry also requested to be buried beside his true and loving wife, Queen Jane, in St. George's Chapel. In early January 1547, Catherine and Henry travelled to Whitehall Palace. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Norfolk and Surrey, and they were both sentenced to death. 3 days later, on the 10th of January, Catherine sent Prince Edward New Year's portraits of herself and Henry. Edward replied the same day, thanking her and addressing the letter to his illustrious Queen and dearest mother. He was unaware of his father's severe illness, as the King and Queen wished to shield him from the knowledge that he would soon bear the burden of kingship. 2 weeks later, Henry announced the names of the men appointed to serve on Edward's Regency Council. Hertford was named Lord Protector during Edward's minority, supported by Cranmer, John Dudley, and others, including the Queen's brother, the Earl of Essex, all of whom favoured reform. However, when someone suggested Sir Thomas Seymour, Henry objected, despite his failing health. He saw Seymour as a self-serving scoundrel, recognising the man's true nature despite the charm that deceived others, and he had personal reasons for his resentment. And on that note, that's where I'm going to leave today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please make sure you leave a like and subscribe, and make sure you turn that notification bell on so that you never miss a video. But until the next one, as always, have a wonderful day. Bye.